I'm Caroline Sinders. I'm a user researcher with the Wikimedia Foundation on the anti-harassment team. For the past 5 years, I've been studying protest and online harassment inside of decentralized networks and looking at social networks. What that means is I study people on the internet, and I look at the ways that they talk to each other. And I try to break down how language exists inside of systems. So how do you think about what is conflict versus abuse? For the past 2 years before I started at the Wikimedia Foundation, I was actually working at IBM Watson on chatbot software. So I was helping take concepts of our dialogue system and put it into front-end design so we could enable consumers to actually set up their own different kinds of chatbot systems without having to have any kind of background inside of machine learning or any kind of tech background. So I would make weird things like this to try to explain to our consumers and clients, how do you think about language inside of technology systems? I'm sure that seems very low level for this audience, but I think it's really important to point out, how do you diagram what language is? Now, I love using weather as an example because it's really innocuous. I think we can all relate to weather in this room, right? So like, what is hot? That's where it gets actually a bit more personal. What I consider hot weather, being from Louisiana, is probably not what you consider hot weather in this audience right now in San Francisco. And feel free to laugh. I'm going to tell really bad jokes while I'm up here. But where it gets not innocuous is, how would you take something like harassment and diagram it out? Now, it's easy to say like what sunny is, or storming maybe, or rain, or a hurricane, or precipitation levels. All these things have meanings that we've spent like years and years and years defining. But with online harassment, it's really been in the past 2 years we started to define what online harassment is into different kinds of word forms. So we have words like doxing, that means the release of public documents. We have things like sea lining, that's when someone jumps into your mentions and keeps asking you why and why and why over and over again to work a victim into a state of frenzy, and then they delete all of their interactions with that person, and then they file a report to say, see, this person was just yelling at me for no reason. That's a really long, complicated example. It's a bit different than trying to define what rain is. So a lot I've been thinking about is inside of these different systems, and sorry, I actually can't see what my next slide is, but that's okay. So how do you think about like the ways in which we're creating these larger scale systems using various kinds of machine learning that's analyzing language to understand what is harassment when harassment's being defined right now? And then even inside of that, how do we think of like what different kinds of algorithms are actually parsing language? An example I sort of like to use is if you pull up a Google search and Google professional hair, on one side you'll see that it's mainly European and white hairstyles. If you Google unprofessional hair, you'll see that it's mainly African American or African and Afrocentric hairstyles. Now, was this algorithm inside of Google, was the search algorithm designed to be biased? It wasn't. Was it designed to sort of actually create systems of harassment to make consumers feel uncomfortable? Well, no. We ended up training on a specific kind of image corpus that sort of gave examples of this is what professional hair is. But the reason I use this as an example is, how could you create a system to recognize harassment when we have like not concrete examples of that? How do you think about creating these sort of concrete examples to train systems on? When we lack that, will we end up in a scenario like this? This is an example of Faceception, an Israeli-based company that's sort of looking at rating emotion inside of faces. Now, putting aside the various surveillance aspects of that, what's important to think about is, how are we defining what emotion looks like on your face? Does it differ culture to culture, person to person, or even community to community? That's very similar with harassment. Harassment is, again, not just one thing. It's a multitude of different kinds of things. Harassment can differ person to person and culture to culture. So how do we think about harassment outside of sentiment analysis, right? How do you think about harassment outside of anger or disgust or joy? How do you think about all these different gamuts of it? And if we're looking at different systems that are trying to rate things, something as broadly as emotion, but flattening it inside of more minimal spaces of just looking at sentiment analysis, are we flattening and losing what harassment is? Are we training systems that perhaps end up creating results like this, which are incredibly erroneous and not quite true? Now, this is problematic if you think about if you're using machine learning first or any kind of search algorithm to feed results back to a company. An example could be with Facebook, right? If you're looking through all these different kinds of harassment reports and you're trying to use a way to actually siphon through all the numerous reports that they get, what what were these systems trained on, and how is harassment fitting inside of those systems? So moving forward, because I work mainly with people, I think a lot about how do you transparently design with algorithms, specifically if you're working in something as emotionally charged as harassment. I spent the past 5 years working specifically with harassment victims, and a big problem is often, why wasn't my harassment report taken seriously? And I think that this actually comes down to how do you articulate that to users? Well, actually, this is like their harassment handbook, and this is all the different kinds of harassment. Actually, the bucket of harassment you were fitting in really fit into this other unit. That's a very technical and I would say like emotionally removed conversation to have with someone that's in a state of emotional fervor as well as emotional pain. As a designer, I think a lot about this because I work at an open source company. The Wikimedia Foundation is the nonprofit that powers Wikipedia. We have to design transparently. But as a designer in general, I think a lot about what kinds of systems are we creating, especially when it deals with emotional trauma, to let users know this is the system you're existing in, and this is where actually the different kinds of harassment you're experiencing fits inside of this system. Can this create more healthy systems between consumers and the company itself, or between the system and the user? I've been on the internet for a while, but probably not as long as some people in this room. But I've been on the internet since about 2000. I remember my parents getting AOL, and I remember pretending to be way older than I actually was, probably in a lot of chat rooms I shouldn't have been in. And what's been really fantastic to see is how conversation has started to exist in different ways inside of social networks. I think that there are actually 4 different kinds of conversation. The reason this is related to harassment is, what are the different kinds of conversations we're having as an individual to an audience, as an individual to a group that is known to me, and an individual to strangers, or individual to individual. So I think that there are 4 kinds of conversations broadly that can exist inside of large-scale networks. The first one's the town hall. This is a pretty good example of that. Especially if this was live streamed. A town hall setting meaning I can see almost everyone, but I actually don't have a very good grasp of how many units or how many people I'm interacting with. Twitter is the best example of this. If you're public on Twitter, you're actually open to all of Twitter. Whether or not you want to engage with all of Twitter is a different thing, but you actually can't see in one go who you're connected to. And that's the most public. This is a system I call of like semi-public and semi-private networks. The next example is the front porch, which is would be this if we were in a smaller room and all the doors were open. Meaning I can see everyone I'm speaking to, but I can control the volume of my voice, but I know that there's openness and happenstance for people to walk by the porch that I'm sitting on and hear me. There's still an ability for me to not quite control who's interacting with me. That is a semi-public and a semi-private interaction. The next one is the living room, which would be this in a very small room with all the doors closed. It's semi-private and semi-public. You're having a different kind of conversation. It's not the most private conversation you can have. And then there's the bedroom, which is the most private conversation. A lot of the way language actually exists inside of these networks is it exists in a binary setting of incredibly public or incredibly private. But that's not the way we interact as people. That's not the way we interact as users. There are so many different kinds of nuanced conversations that we can have inside of these settings. So a big thing to think about with harassment is, what is the intent and what kind of conversation was one user trying to have, and how was another user trying to intervene in that? How do you figure out the intent of how loud someone wanted to be, or the amplification of their words, and how many spaces of intervention can come in from unknown agents? And this is important because social media is a mixed emotional and identity space. It's both professional and personal. People are meeting online, they're falling in love online, they're finding jobs online, they are reconnecting with classmates online. It's not just this singular one space, it actually represents a perfect one-to-one of the kinds of physical interactions we have. Social media, in fact, is this mirror. So with thinking about that with harassment, how do you fold in different kinds of like language mitigation and language analysis inside of this space that's actually so large and so varied? So what I've been thinking about is, how do you start to define harassment, and can harassment fit inside of an Excel spreadsheet? Meaning, how do you take specific definitions of words or different interactions and intent and put them into a space that you could then feed back into a system? How do you take harassment, which is in fact more qualitative data, put it into a quantitative setting, and then start to design harassment or language models based off around that? How do you take something that's really, really difficult and try to make it much more concrete? It feels at times very impossible. This is one of my favorite words, and it's an example of this. My mom hates this word. I really like it. And I like it because it's a complicated word, and if you start to think of harassment at a more word level and attack, looking at or creating a way to sort of keyword block is really important. But I like this word because it represents this problem, the Scunthorpe problem. So it's keyword blocking, and I think it was back, a group of people inside of the city of Scunthorpe, England, were trying to sign up for email addresses. I think it was on Hotmail. Because the word cunt was blocked, they couldn't, because it fits inside of the city that they live in. And I love this example as thinking, like the first step that people try to start solving harassment with is thinking about keyword blocking at the first level. And that's important. But users inside of this system didn't know that the word cunt was blocked and that would affect the city that they lived in. So I use this as an example of how do you think about allowing users to create their own kinds of keyword blocking that feel specific to them, but also revealing what is inside of the different systems that they exist in. This is why it's important to have this sort of representation of user agency. What's inside of a Twitter quality filter, for example? That's the ability that you can turn on for Twitter to algorithmically start to sort of expunge different things that end up in your mentions and what you can see. But what does Twitter consider quality, and does it match with what I consider quality? Or why are certain things served up inside of my Facebook algorithmic timeline? What makes that up? What kind of data is it being fed? Is it solely my data? Is it a social media analytics algorithm that a startup built that was then acquired by a bigger startup? What data did they train that on? What sort of points are they looking at? Is it based off like analytic revenue models, or is it based off trying to design the most optimized experience for users? What is optimization for me versus someone else? These are all these different questions that actually do come into play with online harassment. If you were to try to think of a way to sort of start to autonomously solve or at least mitigate harassment, what is optimization when language changes really quickly, and what is optimization with these really nebulous concepts? This is an example I really love to have different companies walk through, which is how do you think about context of harassment? So I like to start with this one because it's a specific example that actually starts to exist more from the user's end, looking at the data users can give. So take a decontextualized Facebook photo. Just pretend it's 3 gray bodies. Don't add anything else to it. And let's say that someone decides to remove the tag. Facebook says it's great. You can totally remove any photos you're tagged in. What if someone asked to remove the photo? The person that can remove the photo is the person that posted it. So then I start to wonder, why? Why would someone want to remove the photo? Because I feel uncomfortable. Well, uncomfortable doesn't seem to be a threat. So if there was a radio dial for I feel uncomfortable, submit report, it would be ignored, it'd be thrown out, it'd be viewed as spam. What's fascinating about the word uncomfortable is it's actually a dog whistle for different kinds of harassment. I interviewed over 40 victims of Gamergate, and Gamergaters specifically. Gamergate is an online harassment campaign that existed inside of the games world. It started 2 years ago. This resulted in bomb threats being made against different women speakers at different panels, the release of multiple different people's public documents, sustained rape and death threats, etc. Uncomfortable is a great dog whistle for, again, this nebulous form of harassment. And uncomfortable can mean all of these different things. I don't like the photo, I'm afraid to lose my job, I'm afraid to upset my family, or I just feel unsafe. But what's also sort of fascinating about this is, so if this were to put in an interface and it's then submitted as like a report, how can you then fold any kind of algorithmic intervention back into this? Well, you can actually use moderators. And I should also let you know that this is actually secretly a talk to sort of be a big proponent for supervised machine learning. That's my big reveal. I think it's really important to use moderators, especially when you're starting to look at different kinds of language and interaction. Moderators can do a thing that, that machines cannot do very well, which is suss out intent, or at least try to suss out intent. So thinking about this now, on the moderator's end, what can happen? Well, moderators in real time can start to go through different kinds of the reports and mark them as annoying. But a machine learning algorithm could actually then start to learn from why things were marked that certain way. You can rate a level of abuse. Is it because there were certain words in the threat? Is there a growing trend? Perhaps Gamergate gets marked as a higher threat, and it starts off early in real time, so a system could immediately pick up on that. Maybe it's the language that's starting to appear out of these different kinds of harassment reports. There's all these different kinds of analysis that a machine can do faster to then start to automatically tag and learn. But the beginning of this process needs to definitely be human-guided. So I've been thinking a lot about how do you sort of alleviate actually the needs of moderators to, in real time, understand growing trends of online harassment. What I think is so important about this is the data is constantly being updated and fed and retrained to the algorithm. You're not having to sort of worry about grabbing a data set first, running it unsupervised through an algorithm to generate results, and then go back through and look and see how accurate things are. You can use human accuracy immediately in the beginning of training. You're actually creating, I think, more accurate training data and models. This is important because machines can process data and images faster than humans can. So machines can sort of go through and actually look at the systems and create a more self-learning system from this extensive training process. I think this is important because slang and harassment vernacular changes quickly and often. So right now, while I am employed by the Wikimedia Foundation, I actually have a fellowship with BuzzFeed and Arts and Technology Center in New York called Eyebeam. And I spent the past 6 months studying the rise of the alt-right and neo-Nazism inside of spaces like Twitter. What's really fascinating is there's a lot of slang that's being used inside of those spaces that actually isn't sort of being looked at or recognized as harassment. Because again, it's slang hyper-specific to the community itself. So this is what the alt-right subreddit looked like, which is one of the main places I've been sort of scraping and looking at different kinds of, I've been scraping and looking at for analyzing language. What's really fascinating is they call themselves a space of white nationalism. Now, white nationalism is a very institutionalized term to describe a specific kind of racist and racial identity. It's highly charged. It's not a throwaway term. It's not something that you would necessarily hear in everyday life. You have to know what white nationalism means to call yourself a white nationalist. White nationalism is a form of white supremacy that talks about the establishment of the white identity as a main identity, as well as that there should be a country just for white people. This is an inherently violent idea. Part of my research has actually been guided specifically with the Southern Poverty Law Center on being able to recognize these different kinds of terms. So again, what's fascinating here is white nationalism and white identity, those are dog whistles. You have to know what that is to call yourself one. This is what the page looked like the day it was taken down. And again, what you're seeing here are different kinds of words that are intrinsic to the community and known to the community. They may seem innocuous here, but they're anything but. An example is cuckservative, which is, I would say, like a low-level dig you could throw at someone, but it is mainly used by this group. So while cuckservative may not actually be something that's necessarily that bad to be called, it is a good symbol, or a good, I would say, like pointing to the community that uses it. It is a good example of, oh, you probably fit into this bucket. What I've been doing is I've been looking at, so I've created a hate speech database, and I've been looking at the words inside of this database, as well as the most common words that exist inside of different subreddits. This one is from the Donald, actually. These were the most popular words that were used in October. So, and these are the most popular words used inside of their subreddit versus another subreddit. So it's not just the most popular in general, it's in comparison to a variety of other subreddits. So this is an example of the hate speech database that I've built. And so what I'm doing is I'm adding in all this information to sort of tag what these words mean. I'm trying to build, I guess, a Project Gutenberg-esque hate speech database. It's actually currently being used by a variety of different journalistic sites like ProPublica for any kind of big data analysis that they're doing. And what I think is important about this is by being able to sort of build this this dictionary that exists, I don't actually have to maintain it after a certain point. You can look at new words that are appearing in relationship to these words. It can actually start to be more algorithmically filtered. What's important to start off with, I would say human intervention first, is like I can suss out words that I know are like perhaps more of a micro trend, something that would look like an erroneous result. I can see words that are occurring first and seeing how they're used around different things, but also figuring out how words are used inside of conversation. I'm an ethnographer and a user researcher, so if people are using words in a new way and it's not ever explained inside of a conversation, that means it's actually intrinsically part of the community. That means that that word that I don't understand means something to the community. It's important to point out that the majority of these words are actually pulled from indoctrination guides that the alt-right creates. So I've been thinking a lot about innocuousness of words and how you can start to create different kinds of systems and models, effectively data, to feed into different kinds of machine learning algorithms to start to analyze and understand, for lack of a better word, toxicity, and how do you create, I guess, more quantitative research around qualitative methods. I would say about a couple months ago, Google launched their Perspective API, which is designed to analyze toxicity of language and actually work specifically with moderators. They trained it off of data from Wikipedia, the commenting section of the New York Times, The Economist, as well as the Washington Post. And it's designed to help highlight things that could be potentially toxic and alleviate a moderator's workflow. It's not even in beta, it's still pretty much in alpha. It's very, very new, they're still training it. What's important to point out is this phrase only gets a rating of 30%, similar to comments people said were somewhat toxic, meaning it's more in the nebulous, erroneous zone. What's fascinating, though, about this phrase in particular is the ADL has said that this is the most popular phrase of white supremacists. So this is anything but innocuous, but it doesn't seem that toxic. And what makes it toxic isn't that it's secure, predating existence plus future plus white children, it's that it has an intent and meaning to the community itself. How do you start to think about sussing out what intent means? This is where I would say user researchers are very necessary and working inside of supervised machine learning systems to start to analyze and understand language. This is something, again, that humans can do very, very well. And I learned this from simply interviewing a lot of researchers at the ADL. And again, some of these seem fairly innocuous. The one in Farsi actually says, "I hope you have a good day," and in Chinese it says, "I love you." And so again, sort of looking at how it's really easy to throw errors in any kind of system. I love this GIF because it's sort of like the anxiety of how do you start to solve this problem. And I think that there are solutions here. But I think that this is a great time and space for figuring out how do you put researchers, perhaps that even have no background inside of programming, technology, or machine learning, and start to build systems that they can actually create spaces of intervention in. What would it look like to create more collaborative, supervised machine learning systems, specifically if we're starting to analyze language, and if we're starting to look at emerging groups on the internet that are engaging in things that are hard to define, like conflict versus abuse. So again, how do we create spaces that have user-generated definitions of safety and protect moderators? This is pretty much my design call to arms. Thank you. I think we have time for maybe one question. Oh.
So a lot of those things that seem innocuous and are not, that's purposeful, like trying to basically use code, you could say. So have you looked at any past code breaking types of techniques to address this? Like basically that's something that we've been searching for the last at least 60 years. Just curious if anybody is able to translate well now.
I have looked at some abilities of the way in which you can add in. I'm trying to figure out, by code breaking, do you mean the ways in...
Literal code breaking, right?
Oh yeah, no, yes. Somewhat. I've looked less at that. Mainly what I've looked at is how Cockney slang, for example, or rhyming. Things like Pig Latin, how would you break down the ways in which I say something back to you and you could say something in, and looking at a response. So looking at how perhaps predating information inside of an interaction can actually change what the interaction is. So I've been looking at a lot of calls and responses that also use things that feel, that are built upon participation between those in a conversation. Any other questions? Oh.
Wondering how you think about analyzing text from language models.
For sure. I would say, again, like a lot of the data that I'm showing and being used should never be used alone. A lot of this, I think, is looking at like how many different words would exist inside like this coupling of spaces. But when it comes to like sort of looking at and analyzing who is a white supremacist, you can only go based off how people or users label themselves. So you would need to see someone labeling themselves and pointing to themselves as, I adhere to this ideology, and that's the first place you should start. Using these alone to just sort of look at like your intent of, or rather like you are this, I think that should never come out of a space, that should never come out of any kind of like scraping or anything that you're doing inside of a digital space unless you're actually engaging in very in-depth user interviews and you're asking a lot, like a series of questions over a series of months and you're very much embedded in the community. One of the reasons I wanted to create this was also just to see the prevalence of this language and to see how and where this was used and how often it's reoccurring. But also, I think with this, for example, it's important to see that like perhaps the word like cuckservative, again, it's much more aligned to the alt-right and less to like a white nationalist group, but it's also now at this point become a part of like 4chan and 8chan slang. If you exist on 4chan, does that mean you adhere to the ideology of the alt-right? Probably not. But I also wouldn't feel comfortable for any company to like make that assessment or assertion of like, you are this because you said that. I do think it's interesting to see like how much this language or like where it's coming from. And if you're trying to create models to like look at toxic language, being able to have a real conversation around like, well, what is the sentence that this occurred in? And then from there looking at that and trying to understand the intent. But a lot of what I'm doing with my research is also like looking inside of a space like Reddit in particular and looking at things like what are the different links that are being used. Right now I've been analyzing all of the images inside of the alt-right subreddit and looking at the intent of those images. It has to come out of like what is the entire threaded conversation. So like there's a lot of like GIFs that are used as like a way to further a conversation two different users will be having. What's in the image itself? Is it like a Pepe or is it an image of the Holocaust? We've actually seen like some Holocaust images existing inside the subreddit. Are they having a conversation about the Holocaust or are they using this more as an intent to shock each other? Does that make it like more or less something? That I can't say. I think it's more fascinating to sort of look at like these are like unknown entities that people are using to engage in a conversation. They're creating their own language. It's important to study like what is the meaning of the language. Again, a lot of these definitions also come specifically from guides that they've created for new members to sort of define like this is what like this word means. Any other questions? Oh. Right. I have created fake accounts. I don't usually talk to like or engage in like a high-level conversation. I mainly just watch, and then I sort of see how it unfolds. With Gamergate, for example, I interacted with them in my real account. Like, we would have conversations like on Twitter usually, and I would like read a lot of their like subreddit. And would try to circle back and see how many different conversations they were having on a similar topic across all their different platforms. Because they also like archived everything they did in a day, so you could easily sort of see, like they did pretty much their own network analysis. But no, I haven't started yet having in-depth conversations with the alt-right.
How do you think the medium affects harassment? Like, why is there more harassment on 4chan?
I think it's easier to have conversations, like more like sustained conversations or threaded conversations inside those spaces. Like I know with Medium, you can comment on certain things, but I think it's a bit harder to have like this more like intensive, like long conversation because you're having to respond to like someone's essay or like a highlight frame and like adding a comment there, but then someone else is responding to your comment. So it's hard to see like this direct path visually of what people are responding to, whereas with Twitter, until recently, it's really easy to see like the threaded conversations as well as to spread Twitter. So Twitter is an embeddable media. Like you can put it inside of like blog posts, you can put it inside of like digital like journalistic articles, right? It's designed to be consumed off Twitter. Medium, it's hard to consume like an entire article off Medium. You have to like be on the platform itself. And then as you're responding to things, it starts to like, each response starts to become its own little system. With 4chan, for example, it's a board-based conversation. So you're already inside of like a sub-board, and then from there you're starting a conversation, which is another sub-board, and people are responding to that. You can see the entire, like, you can like open it up and see all the different responses people are having. So like visually, it interacts completely differently. So that's like what I often assume is it's very, very easy to like visually see the conversation. Medium makes it a little bit harder. I also think it's the people on Medium too, like the size of Medium, who engages with Medium, like what kinds of conversations are happening on Medium. All right, I think that's it.
Yep. Thanks so much, Caroline.